Let's get peppy. We've got another instant pep. This is Pepisode 72. Hello to the very important peps out there. I've run out of pep puns. That will do for now. This is going to be, as I said, a real quick one. Once again, we're in lockdown now in Sydney, and especially at the ABC. I shouldn't even be talking to you without a mask. You might catch something through a screen, Mr. Brendon O'Connor, who is our guest for today. Dr. Dave is almost better. He'll be back next time, but I should say this is going to be the last podcast for at least another probably 2 weeks. Number one, because we're in lockdown, me and Dave can't get in the same room. But also, we're about to have a holiday for Independence Day on Planet America as well. So I'll get back to you guys before we're back on air, but it'll be a little bit of time, COVID willing. Thank you very much, Brendon, for dropping in as always. Sorry.
Good to be here.
Dr. Brendon.
Yeah.
Now, we've got to be quick. Like I said, we've got probably about an hour of you, and I'm going to spend 15 minutes talking about the friendly Jordies thing, which seems every single person on earth wants me to talk about. So I am going to talk about that. Just very quickly, a bit of housekeeping. We had a person pointing out that, I'll just read it. You implied the UAE is suffering a massive spike because Sinovac is not a good vaccine. While I agree with your assessment of the Sinovac vaccine, in the interest of accuracy, I live in the UAE and we've actually been given Sinopharm, not Sinovac. To my knowledge, Sinovac has not been used at all in the Emirates. That is a correction. So there you go. Sinopharm has its own problems, it seems. But yes, and also an update. We talked about the Iran deal and how when the Iran election came, it might be the end of the Iran nuclear deal. Now, because they'd elect a radical, much less moderate leader, they have elected a much less moderate leader. Well, they've been told who to elect. There was only really one viable candidate, this racy guy. But people are saying that he's going to go through with the Iran nuclear deal anyway. So there you go. I don't have the time to talk about that in detail. We'll do that another time. I just want to flag that as an update. Brendon, let's get right into it. New York mayoral race. You want to talk about that? Tell us about it.
Well, it looks like Eric Adams is ahead. Fairly non-distinguished field from those of you who've spent lots of time following it. No one who's going to go on, I think, to be the next Rudy Giuliani or even the next Mike Bloomberg. But people have been, I think, hoping that there would be a real surge in progressive politics in New York City. And there's a candidate, Maya Wiley, who's done reasonably well, second candidate. But for those electoral nerds out there, they're using the rank system, the Australian kind of preferential voting system. And it seems to have taken them forever to work out how to reallocate over a 3-week period. I know there's a lot of postal votes, so that slows things down. How to drop candidates out and reallocate their votes. They've given 3 weeks to sort that out. So I think someone from the Australian Electoral Commission should just zoom in and say, look, it's not that complicated. We do it and get an election result on the night. But a big issue in that election campaign was crime.
Yes.
I mean, crime numbers in a number of US cities really have been going up. I mean, I had a quick look at the New York statistics for last year were about 305 homicides. Chicago had a stunning 524 homicides for a city of 2.5 million. That's pretty appalling. Baltimore always up there with around 223 homicides for a city of 600,000. And Australia sits around at the moment about 400 homicides a year. So that gives you some kind of comparison. Not surprisingly, Eric Adams, former police officer, has made this big issue in the New York race because it's been, quite an increase during the time of COVID. Crime, gun killings, particularly in some of these major cities. And you can see for all the failings of the Republicans under Trump with the virus, with, delusions about the electoral count, that crime has been an issue that Republicans have had quite a lot of success on historically in city races and national politics. And you can see the Democrats, particularly people like Adams and maybe Biden to some extent, pivoting to, I think, a more moderate position on crime, or at least being more sensitive to the fact that these crime statistics need to be taken seriously. And some of the steam, I think, has gone out of the more progressive arguments about crime, maybe unfortunately, because they are sophisticated arguments that need to be taken seriously. But, that this is, I suppose, an area of vulnerability for the Democrats if these crime statistics stay pretty high over the next next couple of years into the midterms.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about crime in a second. But before I do, I just want to say a couple of things about New York in particular, and then we can get to crime in general in America. The first thing is just my major takeaway from New York, the New York race, is that I'm kind of glad that Andrew Yang went so badly. And the reason for that is not because I don't like Andrew Yang. I actually really like Andrew Yang. but the reason why is because I don't like that someone could make a career by running for president. I don't like that you have a situation that a complete nobody can run for president, be kind of charismatic, and then could become mayor of New York off the back of that. Because if that happened, then next election, there'd be 1 million also-rans running for president to try and make their career. And so while I really like Andrew Yang, I wish he'd do it the other way. He'd do it the right way and build himself up rather than work his way down from president downward. So I'm glad that he basically failed.
A point worth making there is that the run from mayor, particularly of New York, to president has never occurred. No mayor of New York has been president. Calvin Coolidge, who was the mayor, I think, of Northampton in Massachusetts, was the last mayor to become president. So it's not one of the great springboards. I think only 3 US presidents have ever been a mayor, and those mainly in the 19th century, and then gone on to be president. So it's not, it's not what it once used to be, being mayor or even borough president of Brooklyn, which Eric Adams was. That's not what it used to be either. So it's not, it's a lot of responsibility. You've got a lot of people under your command, and if you're interested in maybe substantial kind of change in terms of, inequality, education, policing, it's a big job, a much bigger job, say, than being governor of Texas in terms of its responsibility as being mayor of Chicago in terms of public employees under your direct command.
Yeah. The second thing, I'll just defend ranked choice voting for a moment, and that is part of the reason why, I know, as you say, they could get an Aussie on Zoom, but on top of that, part of the reason it's taking so long for New York is because they take forever to count absentee votes. They have heaps and heaps of absentee votes. So actually, they're not even going to get around to doing the ranked choice voting for absentee votes for another 2 weeks. So that's part of the problem. And the other thing I'd say is, you mentioned Maya Wiley, who was the hope of the left. Well, they're all left, they're Democrats, but the left side of the Democrats, they really got pantsed, because it's not just that Eric Adams won on first choices, or seems to have won on first choices without absentees yet. But on top of that, you had the 3 of the 4 top candidates were from the, inverted commas, moderate wing of the Democrats. Garcia, Yang, and Adams were all fighting for the same votes. Maya Wiley basically had the entire left to herself. So what you'd expect to happen is for Yang, Garcia, and Adams to all have less first choice votes, and then to come through in the preferences where their votes would all preference each other, essentially, whereas Wiley would dominate the first choices of the left. That's what you expect. But she still came second on first choices by like 10%. So that was a particularly poor result for the left of the Democrats in New York, which then goes to what we're talking about crime, and maybe it looms large at the moment in New York, and in fact, in a lot of places in America. I want to ask you why there's a lot of theories floating around about what's going on with crime, because it's strange. It's strange because it's not like crime as a whole has gone up everywhere. It has not. Homicide as a whole has gone up everywhere, like a lot, but violent crime has not gone up in many places, and property crimes in a lot of places have gone down. So Now, some people say, try to explain it using the pandemic. Some people use it, some people say, talk about the Ferguson effect, about police being discouraged by being shat all over by protesters. Some people say it's a defunding the police thing. There's all kinds of ideas floating around. What is your opinion? Where's this spike come from, of homicides in particular?
Well, I think it's got something to do with the pandemic, that people are, for all sort of sadly kind of cooped up. We saw it with the kind of energy of protests, both, on the conservative side and more so with the Black Lives Matter protests. They were large, energetic, and I think people have a lot of energy when you're inside cooped up for quite some time. Unfortunately, I think that might spill over to crime. Chicago, I think, has a specific gang-based crime problem. So that I've been following that for the last 3 or 4 years because the numbers are really upsetting. I mean, disturbing. And there's, a lot of innocents that get killed in these kind of crossfire shootings in Chicago. And there's pretty specific areas for some of this crime. But it's, it's just a sort of blight on kind of America and American society that you have these numbers often of young men. So it's this pretty specific demographic that is largely really overrepresented in these crimes. And also in a place like Baltimore, there's probably many of your viewers who are devotees of The Wire. I've spent a bit of time on the ground in Baltimore, visiting friends there, just walking the streets, hanging out, because what else do you do when you're in the US? And it's a really tough city, and there's some really big problems there. So,
although ironically, the homicide rate in Baltimore went down. It's almost the only place in America where homicide went down. It started very high, but it actually was one of the very few cities that went down.
Yeah, I can't see. You're talking to a screen. I feel like I'm kind of Max Headroom from the 1980s. That I sort of slicked my hair back and.
Well, let's hope you're not obnoxious like Max Headroom. That's my job.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I there's a combination of explanations. There's deep reasons for this, and like I said before, there's a lot of good arguments out there about doing policing really differently in the United States. Whether they can be sustained in electoral politics, that will be, I think, something really sort of important to follow over the next couple of years to see whether that's where the right comes back in American politics, the conservative side comes back on its usual line of toughness. That toughness is what the conservatives have done on communism or terrorism or crime for a number of election cycles. I've even thought maybe conceivably in 15 years, they'll be having a kind of toughness line on the environment. The Democrats were too weak on it. We're the real tough, we're going to ban all of these forms of activities to get really hard on climate change. But I mean, that's probably a fantasy, but you could see that, this is an issue where the Republicans will try to play their kind of traditional formula, which has been pretty successful.
Yeah, I'll just throw a couple of things on the crime issue as well on the pyre. Let the fire burn here. Just some numbers, because I was talking very vaguely there. Just while Brendon was talking, I just whacked up some numbers. In 2020, compared to 2019, violent crime rose 3.3% nationally. Murder rate went up 25%. So that's what I'm talking about. It went way out of control. A couple of just random observations. People who say that it's about either defunding the police or progressive prosecutors or something like that, because there's a few progressive prosecutors going around who are basically letting a lot of people go, and that's pissing off a lot of police people. It wasn't just in places where police were defunded, which actually weren't many places, I might add. And it wasn't in places with progressive prosecutors. Baltimore is one of the places with a progressive prosecutor, and the homicide went down. Homicide rate went down. Homicides rose in 60 of the 69 major police departments, all across America, okay? Regardless of the policies, defunding or otherwise. So it's not because of that. It's got to be something broad, like the pandemic, like you say, Brendon. Another thing I'll just say is that there's an interesting thing about guns, which people have pointed out as well, which is because there's a lot of gun sales last year. Not just gun sales, but also a lot of guns going around. I've got a few stats here. In March and April, in 10 major cities, police made less stops and arrests, significantly less stops and arrests because of the pandemic. But out of the stops that they made, they were more likely to find a firearm. Much more likely to find a firearm. Let me give you some numbers. In Chicago, we just mentioned Chicago, police stops decreased nearly 70% between January and May 2020. But officers found 83% more firearms in May than in January. That's not just rate, that's in total. So, and even in places like Tucson, Arizona, which is a much smaller city, 39% fewer arrests in April and May compared to a year earlier, 29% more arrests for weapons or firearms possession. So guns are out there. So it's possible. I'm not saying that there is one cause. I think there's a lot of causes. But it's possible that if for whatever reason people were carrying more guns, maybe because that people were just generally feeling more harassed, more like it's the end of the world, like in a pandemic environment, for whatever reason, they're carrying more guns. When they have their fights, even if they have the same number of fights, they'll be more often to use guns. You end up with homicides. Like that could possibly be. I'm not speculating. I think one of the dumbest things you can do is to go, oh, it's all because of this. It's usually very complicated crime. It usually takes 5-10 years to know what was going on. Let's also see what happens this year. Does it go back down again? Let's find out. We don't know yet. So anyway, I just wanted to just flag that.
Historically, violent crime, murders have gone up during economic downturns, during various drug plagues. Obviously, the crack, epidemic was a real accelerator of crime in New York. I did a bit of work with the New York Police Department for the Justice Department in the US, sort of just as in the late 1990s, I was interviewing arrestees about drug use in Brooklyn and mainly in Staten Island, because no one else wanted to work in Staten Island. It was the most boring place of New York, and I was living there, so I got this part-time job to pay my rent. And I got to see a real sense of kind of the over-arrest of minorities, the sort of over-policing of minorities. I was in Staten Island, it's a very white place. A lot of police officers lived there, but most of the people I interviewed were Hispanic or Black young men. So there was, there's clearly, I think, there is a real legitimacy to the kind of arguments that de Blasio, in some ways as mayor of New York, ran on, that there'd been an over-policing and some of the zero tolerance stuff had gone way too far in New York, and crime had decreased elsewhere, Boston, because of the economy, because of the drug sort of trade changing. So that, I think there's really legitimate sort of really systemic arguments to be made about the police. But on the flip side, you see quite a sort of increase in police resignations, early retirements or taking retirements over the last 6 months, that there is it's a tough time to be a police officer. And it's a job where you need, people who have got good values and people who are, willing to take on board some of the evidence about policing and some of the ideas about change. And so I think, we're in for, this is a fascinating area of debate. And I think we've got former police officer and Eric Adams likely to be elected, I think probably mayor of New York, whether it's just one of these pendulums that swings back, or whether there's going to be a more sensible kind of debate post de Blasio, and people are starting to, already talking of de Blasio sort of nostalgia, even though I was thought of as a bit of a goofball in some ways. He's a much more moderate figure than in New York has had for a considerable time as a mayor.
Yeah, I feel like the morale issue with police would particularly be a case in Portland, where, every city will have their own situation, but Portland, there's been a riot pretty much every night for the last 12 months. And it's not BLM guys, it's anarchists and they're like real rat bags, and they keep on getting arrested, and then the prosecutor lets them go. I can see why the police would be really pissed off with it basically being punching bags every single night in Portland for 12 months and why they just want out of there. But different cities will have different situations. By the way, just also with numbers, we should always compare to the past, because we do need to remember that whenever we talk about crime rises, it's always in context of the last 20 years, 40 years, crime rates have been going down. And in fact, even this massive spike, it's the largest spike in homicide ever, I believe, in terms of raw numbers, obviously more population now, still only puts America up to the homicide rate of 1998. And back in 1980, there was almost twice as many homicides. So we do need to put this in context. But let's see what happens this year.
Over 1,000 people have been killed a year in New York by homicides. You know, it's alarming at 300. Yeah. But, you know, in context, isn't it?
That's right. Do you have anything else to say about crime before we move on?
No.
Okay, done. All right. Let's talk about Congress briefly, because there was a lot of highs and lows this week. We talked about the infrastructure deal, which has just been agreed to by Joe Biden, which I still am not sure is going to come together, because it's assumed that there's going to be a reconciliation bill that goes with this infrastructure bipartisan bill. I can't see Republicans agreeing to allow Democrats to do whatever they like with their partisan bill, and then agree to a bipartisan bill on top of that. Anyway, we'll see what happens there. What I want to focus on, though, is voting rights and the filibuster. And the reason I want to focus on that is because we saw something we have not seen before this week, which was Joe Manchin actually shitting or getting off the pot. Like, rather than just talking about bipartisanship all the time and going, oh, why can't people be more bipartisan? He actually went out and tried to create bipartisanship by making his own bill about voting rights. Rather than just whinging about, I don't like For the People Act, he came up with his own. I want to read you what's in it, because, to be honest, I think it's a great bill. And I hope that, I don't know if it's going to, well, we'll get to this. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I wish it would. Let me read you. Okay, for a start, he's got the same campaign finance transparency requirements that were in the For the People Act. Not the public funding bits, but just transparency bits, where you've got to disclose your full spending, disclose who's responsible for your online ads, that kind of stuff. He's also adopted the ethics suggestions, including forcing presidential candidates to reveal their taxes. He's got all that. But the major stuff is in election day laws and election laws. So let's go through these. Number one, make election day a public holiday, which I could not agree more to. Like, that's such a big deal with election day, is poor people work and they can't get off work. Make it a public holiday. That's a great idea. Two, mandate at least 15 consecutive days of early voting for federal elections, including 2 weekends. Sounds reasonable to me. Three, ban partisan gerrymandering and use computer models for independent redistricting. Sounds reasonable to me. 4, require voter ID with allowable alternatives, such as utility bills, power bills, to prove identity to vote. I've been saying this forever. I might have said this to you at our last podcast. I've forgotten. The Democrats go on about how voter ID is suppressive. At least they did until Joe Manchin said it. Now they've all fallen in line behind him. But they say it suppresses votes, but it only suppresses votes when you have restricted ID. If you can use almost anything as ID, a bill or anything that people have, then it's not restricting the vote. And voter ID is hugely popular in America amongst Democrats as well. In terms of the base, the numbers are, this was just a recent Monmouth poll, 80% support voter ID laws, including 62% of Democrats and 84% of non-white people. The Democrats are supposedly protecting black and Hispanic people from voter ID laws. They want the voter ID laws. You just want to make it more open what the ID is. And that's what Joe Manchin wants. He wants to have utility bills, etc. I think that's great. Phone bills, that's a great form of ID. If someone wants to fake a phone bill and a utility bill, hey, let them, and you don't catch them, get away with that single vote. That's not going to make much of a difference. I don't think it's going to happen. I think that will be enough to ensure voter integrity. But anyway, number 5, automatic registration through the Department of Motor Vehicles. Sounds like a great idea. Registration is stupid, with the option to opt out. Require states to promote access to voter registration and voting for people with disabilities and older individuals. Sounds good. Prohibit providing false information about elections to hinder or discourage voting. Increase penalties of voter intimidation. Sounds good. Require states to send absentee by mail ballots to eligible voters before an election if they're not able to vote in person. Essentially, force them to send absentee ballots to people who have an excuse. Sounds reasonable to me. Require Election Assistance Commission to develop model training programs. Fine. Require states to notify an individual if the polling place changes. Sounds reasonable. Allow for maintenance of voter rolls by utilising information derived from state and federal documents. That's something Democrats don't tend to like. But they call it purging the rolls. But I can understand why people don't like having lots of dead people on the rolls and people who have moved and all the rest of it. Tidying up the rolls, I don't think in principle that's a problem. That sounds reasonable to me. It's just a question of how you do it. Do you cull people who for no reason whatsoever, or do you have some kind of proper process? Sounds like Joe Manchin wants a proper process. Establish standards for election vendors based on cybersecurity concerns. Good. Allow provisional ballots to count for all eligible races regardless of precinct. That's a great one. Do you know in America, if you go to the wrong precinct, you can't vote in that precinct? Now, some precincts have what they call provisional votes and then they count. Some don't. He's saying nationally, provisional votes count. So if you go to the wrong precinct, you can still vote. That sounds like a good idea to me. He's been listening to PEP, Joe Manchin. These are all my ideas. What do you reckon?
Well, those who've been following the Arizona Supreme Court case know that, life could be a lot worse. I mean, one of the things Arizona legislature trying to stop those votes from district, if you vote in the wrong district, it not being counted, trying to stop voting on a Sunday before an election, the day where, people who have to work in, low paid work may have some time off. So 10 times more likely a black person, according to Elaine Kagan. I listened to some of the Supreme Court arguments, and Kagan said 10 times more likely that a black person will vote on a Sunday than a white person, and a black person is likely to wait 10 times longer to vote than a white person. Now, I imagine she's got enough research assistants that they've got to be pretty decent statistics, and rather than just things off the top of the head. But, therefore, federal law is required. The Congress needs to act, or all of these states are going to get to a kind of lowest common denominator. The one thing I'm not so sure about is the voter ID stuff. I mean, shouldn't legislation be addressing a problem? Is there a problem? There might be a perception, and part of the purging dead people, that's a perception. So get them. I agree with you there. But the voter ID stuff, you can imagine it being wound back to this particular ID, and then the idea that you have, partisan ID checkers going to elections. That just reeks of, strong arm strong arm tactics, which are pretty undemocratic and do a lot to sully the image of the United States. I think globally, those are you hear a lot about that kind of potential partisan intimidation on election days, in recent presidential elections, maybe more so than it actually occurs sometimes. But the specter of it, I think, is really awful in terms of just, a belief that America is a decent democracy. So I'm less convinced that there's a problem to be solved with ID. And it will, of course, be the most itinerant, the poorest, the kind of, those people who are sort of on the margins of society who do have a tendency to vote for the Democrats, who are going to be disadvantaged by this.
Fair enough. The thing I find interesting with all this, though, is, okay, Joe Manchin, as I said, he put some skin in the game. He said, here you go. You don't like For the People Act? Here's a proposal. Democrats all jumped on board. Stacey Abrams just said, absolutely, yes. Let's do it. They were all on board, even though there was proposals in there that the Democrats do not support, like the purging voter thing, the voter ID, etc. They said, no, let's do it. That's fine. Let's do it. Republicans, how did they react? Because this is the telltale with the filibuster. Is it purely for obstruction, or is it good faith? And what we found is, number one, they all said, oh, this is both Mitch McConnell, Roy Blunt, they all started describing it as Stacey Abrams' proposal. even though it was Joe Manchin's proposal, because they were trying to obviously argue in bad faith. And I read this on the show. This statement from Mitch McConnell from beginning to end was an absolute pile of arse. Let me read it to you, Brendon. In reality, the plan endorsed by Stacey Abrams is no compromise. It still subverts the First Amendment to supercharge cancel culture and the left's name and shame campaign model. What the hell is that? It's just complete gibberish. It's just Mad Libs.
There's not a critical race theory in there, Jess.
Yeah, you should have. Anyway, and then what happens? They bring it up. They have the chance to debate, to talk about Joe Manchin's proposal. They didn't get a single vote. Not a single vote to debate it. And Chuck Schumer was very clear when he made this proposal of debating the For the People Act. It wasn't just the For the People Act. It was all electoral reform. And they got 0 votes from Republicans' debate. So that tells me bad faith. That's what that tells me. Because if they had good faith, they'd try and get this up or something. They've got their own proposals. Yeah, Republicans have their own electoral proposals. You might not realise this because they never talk about them. They just go, oh, let's move on. But I noticed here, hang on, where is it? Republicans want to have a bill that forces states to say how many ballots they have on election day. That's fair enough. I don't have a problem with that. And for all mail ballots to be postmarked. I think that's a fantastic idea. Because you remember how we had a huge issue in 2020 about some ballots weren't postmarked, so you didn't know if they were sent after election day or not. That's a great idea. Why don't you debate this bloody bill and put that in there? It's a Republican reform, but they didn't. And so...
No, the postmark thing's a good thing. One of the sort of little told stories of the 2000 election was there were probably military votes that were sent after the election day, whether they were, voted after or before. It's hard to tell, but that was one of the sort of signs of how, the Gogh Lievin team played a bit nice, was that they accepted those as being, in good faith, where I think a tougher approach might have been, if you can't prove that you voted before the election or on the election day, you don't get to vote after the election day. And that's a basic principle. Yeah. So, I agree. I think the Manchin compromise is far better, I think, than certainly nothing. But, Chaz, is it going to lead to the filibuster? The Democrats knocking it over and saying, well, voting rights is too important and the filibuster might have to go. And I personally, I'd support that.
Oh, I would support that too. It's a question of, in reality, is Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema going to support that? That's what it comes down to. Joe Manchin, they asked, I've got a quote from him directly after he'd just been punched in the mouth by every single Republican with an obvious show of bad faith. He said, over the past month, I have worked to eliminate the far-reaching provisions of S1 for the People Act, which I do not support. I've found common ground with my Democrat colleagues on a new version of the bill that ensures our elections are fair, accessible and secure. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues refuse to allow debate of this legislation, despite the reasonable changes made to focus the bill on the core issues facing our democracy. So he acknowledged what just happened, but I don't feel like he's any closer to getting rid of the filibuster. I should say that Heidi Heitkamp, when we interviewed her, she seemed to be very sure that Joe Manchin was eventually going to move against the filibuster if there continued to be... She said he's playing the long game. She said she seemed to think he would eventually come around. I don't know about Kyrsten Sinema, though. She seems to be the person who seems to love the filibuster the most. So I don't know. I'll tell you what, if they don't get rid of the filibuster, you can already see what's going to happen. Mondaire Jones tweeted out something about, what is it? I've got it here. Basically, he said, our democracy is in crisis. We need the president to act like it. Already blaming Biden for Republicans abusing the filibuster and moderate Democrats refusing to get rid of the filibuster. Biden's got nothing to do with that. And if you have a situation, if filibuster stays and then you start getting serious obstruction over the next 18 months and people start blaming the president for that, the left start blaming the president for that. We've seen this show before. It ends with the Democrats getting pulverised in the midterms and the Republicans dominating the next little while. So, and that's the whole thing with the filibuster. It rewards the obstructor. That's what's so awful about the filibuster. You put the government in a position where they rely on the minority working against their own interests to get anything happening. And that's not a sustainable situation in any democracy, where you rely people to hurt themselves to get things happening. Because it's rational. Mitch McConnell's been completely rational. And that's what's frustrating about it. So, look, I hope they end the filibuster. I don't care if you have these Democrats like Kirsten Sinema saying, oh, what happens when Republicans are in power? Well, of course they'll be in power. I mean, number one, that's how democracy works. If people want Republicans to pass bills, they should pass bills. And number two, I don't feel like saying, oh, well, if Republicans can do something, isn't it better that they do nothing and we do nothing? No, it's better that someone does something, I feel, than no one does anything. I don't think that's it's so cynical to say it's better that no one does anything to stop Republicans doing something.
I mean, elections have to have consequences. Being in the majority has to be of value. It doesn't, and you should be punished for what you do in the majority, not for what you didn't do in the majority. And so I've long been for it. I mean, with Obama, I think there was the memories of George W. Bush and the sort of use of it in the last sort of period around the war on terror, some of the things that the filibuster was potentially able to be used for. But, I think the alarmist arguments are so totally overwhelmed by the just not addressing basic issues arguments, and that's, I'm all for getting rid of it totally.
Now, there's something I've promised the Peppers for weeks, and I've now that we're probably going to have the last podcast for a little while, I really should do this, and that is I've promised the Electoral Count Act a few times. I'm going to try and keep it short, okay? I'm going to make it as short as I can. What I'm referring to here is, to me, the elephant in the room. I strongly support Joe Manchin's proposals. Gerrymandering is a disgrace, all that stuff. But there is a more glaring problem facing America, and it's a problem that can be solved without worrying about filibusters. You only need a majority to fix this, but they need to fix it, and no one's even talking about fixing it. So let me just tell you right now, the issue is, and after this we can talk about Hunter Biden art, okay? Get ready, you're gonna go on that one. Okay, all right. The issue is this, that we have two situations where no matter what happens in an election, they can be subverted. Number one, if the states, like say Arizona, go nuts, don't accept a popular vote, say it's because of fraud or some shit like that, and then the state legislature decides who wins Arizona's electoral college votes. That's the first thing. That didn't happen yet, but we got mighty close. And project forward a couple of years, that may well happen. You can so see if Arizona or Georgia or Pennsylvania is really close, and whoever's in power, at the moment it would be Republicans, but who knows if Democrats might be like this in the future as well. Say, you know what, we think it's fraudulent. The result was fraudulent. We're not going to accept it. We vote the other side, our side. Won the election in this state. That's the first problem. Massive problem. Nothing in For the People Act deals with that. Second problem, what happens if, to take the 2020 example, you get to Congress and Republicans are holding Congress and the Senate, and they say, we're rejecting, when they have their little January the 6th kind of meeting, they say, we reject what the Electoral College said, we reject the votes from Georgia and Arizona, and we say Trump won. What do? Now, until now, we never thought that was even possible. But I think it's become possible. So let's deal with it. This is how you deal with it. Electoral Count Act is the act that's responsible for all this shit. Okay, that's what allows a single House member and a single senator to trigger a contest of any state's electoral vote in January, okay? So what do? Ed Kilgore wrote about this a few months back. and I've been storing it ever since. Number one, he says, you clarify that only state-certified electoral votes may be counted in Congress. That's the first thing. So that gets rid of Congress just going over the top and just making up whatever they want. They have to, the only thing they can count are state-certified electoral votes. Two, you make it a supermajority required to decertify any state's electoral votes, not a majority. Okay, that's, and when I say supermajority, I mean 2/3 majority, okay? So you need both parties to agree to decertify a state's results. You may never get that. That's probably a good thing because we don't want the Senate to overrule a state vote. Three, we make it clear that the Vice President's announcement role does not imply the power to choose non-certified over certified electors. So this Mike Pence thing, just never an issue ever again. Put it in black and white, okay? Four, we make electoral vote challenges during the procedure in Congress require more than the support from one House member and one Senate member to start the debate. At the moment, one member in each House can start the debate about a state's votes. Make it much more than that. Okay, so that would take care of Congress overruling the states, those things, right? What about the states being dodgy? What do you do about that? Okay, well, the Electoral Count Act right now says that no electoral vote or votes from any state which shall have been regularly given by electors whose appointment has been lawfully certified shall be rejected, but the two houses concurrently may reject the vote or votes when they agree. Okay, so right now it says that if the votes have been regularly given by electors whose appointment has been lawfully certified, that does not say voters, okay? So what you do is you change that to be this. This is from Dan McLaughlin, by the way, never Trumper. You define regularly given. Congress must treat a certified slate of electors as regularly given if an argument to the contrary could have been presented to a court, whether or not it was. So if you do not go to court and the court orders that it wasn't regularly given, then you cannot declare it regularly given if it's not a vote, if you see what I mean. So that stops states unilaterally overruling votes without court input. Because you want to have the capacity in case there is fraud, but it should go through a court, right? Also, states that chose in advance to hold a popular vote should be barred from claiming that they failed to make a choice simply on the basis of challenging the integrity of the election. So they can't go, we had a vote, but we don't like the result. If you have a vote, you have to follow through on the vote unless the court finds otherwise. So you do that, you take care of the states. That cannot be filibustered if they do that. Just a majority, that's all you need. Get it done. Okay, sorry to just go on the soapbox there, but just talking about it.
I mean, this has been keeping me up at nights as well. I mean, I've long been worried about the unfaithful elector who in the 270, 269 election crosses into, as people did when Ford was, up for election, someone went for Reagan. There's a number of times where people have chosen another candidate rather than the chosen one by the people. I mean, the simple solution is the person who gets the most votes across the United States is declared the president, and that would be by a clear margin.
That'd be nice.
That's the short sort of, 10-second version of what you're saying. The state-based electoral college system, surely there will be a moment where someone has the courage to run against it as a model that no one in America can explain. Most people on television who are anchors of political shows on CNN or Fox don't really understand it, let alone the people who vote for it use it. So, that much more simplified system would get around these potential disasters, really, that you're kind of trying to rule out through, sensible ideas. But there's, there's just so much potential for undemocratic action if you let these occur at the state level, as we see with the voting rights sort of restrictions that are going across a number of states at the moment. that the answer really is just to nationalize it and say there's one president, there's one election. It's not a series of governors that you're sending.
Yeah, no, that'd be nice. That would be nice. I'd love them to do that. Let's move on. I'm just looking at the clock. Let's talk about Biden ethics, which, as I said, the Hunter Biden thing. Just to introduce this concept, Walter Schaub, who was the director of the Office of Government Ethics during Obama, threw an absolute nana on Twitter last week. So basically, he just had enough of what he saw as poor ethics from the Biden administration. In particular, he was responding to a story about how 5 children of Biden's top aides had gotten sweet administration jobs, in addition to the Chief of Staff, Ron Klain's wife getting a nice job and Press Secretary Jen Psaki's sister getting a nice job. He tweeted out this, just quickly, I'll just roll through this. This is actually a summary. He went on forever. I'm sorry, I know some folks don't like hearing any criticism of Biden, but this royally sucks. I'm disgusted. A lot of us worked hard to tee him up to restore ethics to government and believe the promises. There's a real fuck you to us and government ethics. The responses from people who spent 4 years complaining the other side was putting party over country are pathetic. They sound just like MAGAs. The jobs went to privileged kiddos with mummies and daddies who cozied up to POTUS. Nepotism is illegal. Even the fucking head of presidential personnel, who is supposed to be keeping them honest, has a child who's a recent college grad working in the administration and the spouse of the White House Chief of Staff, for crying out loud. This is ridiculous. What a fucking failure. When, he goes on, where are we? He goes on to say, do I sound bitter? Hell yeah, I'm bitter. I'm the stupid moron who fell for his false promises. I wasn't naive enough to think he'd be a transformative president. He told us he'd be plain vanilla, but I thought there was momentum behind his ethics promises. Boy, was I stupid. I don't love having a milk lobbyist running USDA or a strategic advisor, i.e. shadow lobbyist running the State Department, or the brother of Biden's top White House advisor lobbying the executive office of the president through a firm the Biden appointee founded. We've got a Raytheon board member leading the Department of Defense. We've got private equity fund people in the White House and at state. You've got corporate execs and big firm lawyers who represent corporations throughout. Is he better than Trump? Yes. But all that says is he better than a straight-up crook. That cannot be the standard for ethics. Is he doing some things right? Yes, absolutely. He's doing great with the pandemic. He's starting to rebuild alliances, thank goodness. But authoritarianism and corruption go hand in hand. If we don't clamp government, we're setting the table for the next authoritarian. Speaking of which, Biden's administration is fighting tooth and nail to stop congressional oversight, not just of this administration, but of the Trump administration as well. And then went on. Then the next week, this story broke. Tell us about it, Brendon.
Well, you've stolen it with what a great set of quotes, and that man's my new hero. For those of us who have long followed the trail of families, hangers-on that have got jobs, the Reagan sort of administration, the Bushes, Clinton, got a bit of pushback because he didn't employ all of the sort of achy-breaky Arkansas kind of state troopers that had followed him around from hotel to hotel over the years. But Monica Lewinsky was in the White House because her uncle gave money to the Clinton campaign. And that was, just one of those hundreds of sort of kickbacks that American politics at the presidential level often runs on. Hunter Biden, though, is in a sort of class of his own. It was as the basis of a re-election campaign. I don't think Hunter Biden was going to cut it for Donald Trump. But for those of us who like a bit of salacious scandal, he is someone to follow. His stories of his own memoir, for those who are getting into the minor figures of presidential relatives, is probably worth looking up, where he admits to a lot of maybe a lot of honest failings or exaggerations. But now he's got into art, having had a few other avenues closed off. And some people are very worried that if you're willing to pay $500,000 or you're willing to pay, a huge amount of sums for Hunter Biden art, it may be, attempt to carry favor with the president. Some of the art critics have got on the sort of criticism, one particularly I'm taken by, who has described his work, Scott Indesick, who described his work as suitable for a dermatologist's waiting room, and then went on to say, I guess it is important that wounded men of a certain age and privileged background have the opportunity to find themselves creatively. He went on to say, it's just too bad everyone else is expected to pay attention. The world of art criticism and comedy are obviously, not too far from each other. Than the kind of nastiness of some of the critiques from well-known art critics. Another one saying this brings George W. Bush back as someone that needs to be considered a bit more as an artist. People are willing to pay this amount of money for Hunter Biden art. So it's, it's a story that, has Vanity Fair written all over it, doesn't it? That's the Hunter Biden story. The class act was when his brother, Beau Biden, died. He started dating Beau Biden's widowed wife for a period of time. And that sort of gave sort of memories of kind of French and British aristocracy, didn't it, of the 16th or 15th century, that it was an obligation maybe.
I was impressed by the restraint. You don't often say this. I was impressed by the restraint Trump showed. I don't think he ever mentioned that. When I found that out back in about 2019, I thought, oh God, if Biden becomes a nominee, Trump will never shut up about that. But he never once mentioned it. So there you go. That was a surprise.
Probably didn't think there was anything wrong with
it. You brush past one element of this, which we really should back over, just to emphasise. Hunter Biden has no background in arts whatsoever. Then no one thinks he's an artist of any kind. Yet people are saying he's going to get paid $500,000 for each of his works. Now that's the upper range, but still they're saying I think it's $75,000 to $500,000 for each work of art. And I tell you something which he didn't mention, which we definitely have to back over: confidential sales as well. You never find out who it was who paid $500,000 for Hunter Biden's work of art. But of course, Hunter Biden would know, and Joe Biden would know, just we wouldn't know. And that to me is a real key thing. And also, that's a key thing for Schaub as well, who, of course, did another Twitter thread when that story came out. And he made the point that Hunter should at least disclose the identity of the purchasers so the American people can see who might be trying to gain access to the government. But I also think that's ridiculous that Hunter Biden is even going forward with this sale as a first-time artist. He can't possibly think anyone is paying him based on the quality of the art. This smells like an attempt to cash in on a family connection to the White House. At a minimum, the president should be asking his son not to go through with this auction. And then he went on to try and sell his macaroni art from when he was in kindergarten.
Isn't this a possibility of the new great fundraising tool? The various abstract, the sort of, squiggles and doodles and, attempts at being Jackson Pollock late at night will find their way out there as a fundraising thing. I mean, it does, the mind does boggle a bit in that regard.
It does. And we've been joking around, but the reason I mention it, even on this very short podcast, is because it hasn't gotten much press. And it's awful. Like, honestly, let's just be serious for a second. That is awful. That is such an obvious way to bribe a president. That you are giving their son, who they clearly care a lot about and who clearly likes the income, $500,000 a pop privately with no disclosure whatsoever for bullshit art. That is just out and out corruption. And that shouldn't, I don't know if it's going to happen after it got a little bit of coverage, but it absolutely should not happen. I could not emphasize enough.
We should start a campaign that he should donate most of it to charity. I mean, that's the...
that'd be good.
This should be going straight into refuges and, wildlife preservation and,
not most of it.
Food sort of,
Yeah, not most of it, all of it. It's not like Hunter Biden actually is doing it tough. He'll be okay. But anyway. Like, if he was an actual artist, that's a different thing altogether. But he's not an artist. It's bullshit. Anyway. All right, okay. Do you want to quickly tell us the Is America Back stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there was an interesting op-ed by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times a couple of days ago, talking about, Biden talking up America as back ready for leadership. I think the last time we talked, I said that doesn't come with 6 months in office. That comes with a lot of hard work and a lot of repair on an international front. But part of that is to present yourself as kind of a model in terms of education, in terms of women's rights, in terms of voting rights and minority rights, in terms of all sorts of classic OECD indicators for those of us who get really excited about those tables. And Dr. Dave and I, with our fine colleagues, Professor Tiffin and Annika Gogh, put out a book a couple of years ago called How America Compares. And the short story that Christoph told, that our book tells in 400 pages, is that it doesn't compare that well on a lot of social indicators. It's not in a position to sort of command kind of exceptionalism and respect and leadership. It's in a position where, on maths education or arrest rates or homicide rates or, ease of voting, it does pretty poorly on a number of indicators. So, the old argument that Obama, I think, at times ran, and wise people have often said, you've got to get your house in order first before you want to claim leadership. You can't just say, well, as you were saying before, I was better than that crook who was in the White House previously, and we're back ready to lead and ready to be a model. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And there, as we were talking last time, there's encouraging signs on some of the spending on stimulus to do with anti-poverty stuff, maybe some of the infrastructure program, but it's a long way to go. It's not declaring leadership after an election or after 6 months in office or 4 or 5 months in office. It does take a fair amount of front.
If it's not already in the book list, I'll put that in the book list. You can have a look for yourself. Just click on the blurb underneath the YouTube video or the Facebook video, and you'll see it in the book list right there. Now, Brendon, we've got about 6 minutes of your time. So do you want to pick the two topics we've got left over here? Critical race theory. Oh, there's a book. Yeah, show us. We got critical race theory, and we've got lab leak, which I did talk about last week, but we couldn't record it because of a massive stuff up. So which would you prefer that we do in the time remaining you have?
Well, I suppose for Australian sort of listeners, viewers, the critical race theory stuff got a run in the Australian Parliament this week. Pauline Hanson put forward an item to be voted on about banning critical race theory from Australian high school education. Yep. And it got a majority vote, I believe. There was an article in The Conversation about this. So it's a good example of one of these kind of phrases from the United States, like communism or socialism or a range of things, that gets into the kind of global sort of right, gets into the language sphere, I suppose, and people start to think this is the new terrible thing without probably much knowledge of, this is based on a lot of sort of long-standing legal scholarship. It's really an area which comes out of, a Harvard academic. One of the people who was the first to get onto this, Professor Bell, who taught a course at Harvard many years ago trying to sort of look at structural racism, and then wrote a book that came out from his university course. So this isn't, this isn't something that's just been dreamed up in the last couple of years. It's got quite a pedigree, and sure, there's simplified versions of it, but for it to, it does remind me a bit of the days of Glenn Beck with his whiteboard. Yes. And how everything was connected to these two anti-poverty scholars, Piven and Cloward, who were big sort of advocates for the rights of the poor in the early 1970s and for poor people's democracy. And he was able to link them in every way to an Obama policy. It brings back sort of flashbacks of the whiteboard on Fox News and those rather sort of extraordinary, almost comic performances from Glenn Beck in the early Obama days.
Look, those performances are still around. They're just not from Glenn Beck. Like, just take this, for example, from Michael Savage this week. It's extraordinary.
It started in the same kind of thing started in Germany. The Jews were no good. The Jews did this. The Jews did that. The next thing you knew, they were being excluded from swimming pools. They didn't put them in concentration camps overnight. I studied this intimately. I am Jewish. I know how this starts. Attacks on white people is exactly what was done to the Jews in Germany in the 30s. Don't fall for this garbage. This is the road to the death camps.
Now, I should say, I'm not 100% clear. We've talked about this on the show before, about what critical race theory actually is. Dr. Dave talked about it for a while. But, different people have different definitions of this. Like, even academics have different definitions. Like, Dr. Dave was running with basically a structural racism kind of definition. How do you take it?
Yeah, that's what I'd sort of follow, that's where it comes from. And then someone like Kimberly Crenshaw brought in sort of intersectionality into critical race theory to say that you can't just look at race, you've got to look at where it intersects with gender and class and disability. And so it is, this is a series of academics who are putting out papers that most of us, most people would never be able to get through the density of footnotes and counter-referencing to other academics, has become this kind of cause célèbre for people saying, well, no, there's, these complex arguments really about the roots of ongoing racism, to be sort of talking about it as a parallel to the Holocaust, is kind of is rightly laughable. And just the sense that, this has any parallel to the rise of, Hitler's Nazi party and the Nuremberg rallies is, it takes a very fertile imagination to work with that kind of comparison. So I think that, David Smith's a real expert in this area. This is one of his sort of academic kind of real strengths, and he's, he'd be right onto it. And my sense would also be that it really is this focus on structural racism, that there are racism in institutions because they were largely designed to benefit wider Americans or white Americans, and they're very limited sort of, the police force itself, very limited number of Black police officers, very limited sort of, history of Black leadership until very recently in most police departments. So just, getting more people into the system is one of the many arguments for, making these institutions, more fairer.
And you end up with a situation where only 35%, this is a YouGov poll, only 35% of the country has heard something about critical race theory and believes they have a good idea of its meaning. But out of the people who do, it's 38-58 approval. So you've got people strongly disapproving, but almost no one seems to either have heard of it or understand it. It's just bizarre. Like, to me, the simplest, I said something like this before, but I want to show you a graph, which I think is amazing. This sums up to me what critical race theory, what structural racism, I'm going to say, because that's where I'm comfortable. Structural racism is about. Look at this graph. This graph shows you what the percentage of white people's wealth that Black people have over time versus what white people think is the case. And the answer is, and as you can see, it goes from about 10% of white people's wealth to 20% of white people's wealth, up and down. We're currently around 15%. But over time, from the 60s to now, we've gone from white people thinking that actually it's not in white people, it's all people. The average perception of Black family wealth has gone from about 50% of white people's wealth to almost 100%. People aren't realising the system is not changing. It's not changing. And it doesn't mean that there's some bad guy going around trying to intentionally hurt Black people. But for whatever reason, the system is set up, society is set up, so it keeps on replicating the same negative outcome, the racially discriminatory outcome. And that's not about death camps. Anyway. So now it's.
Wealth is a great example of structural racism, because it's something that accumulates over time, and wealthier people tend to pass on to their children. So the average African American household has about 15 or so $100,000 of wealth, that's ownership of property, money in the bank, and the average white family has around sort of $120,000 worth of wealth. So, a factor at times around sort of 8 to 10 times as much. And that doesn't change much over time. You get, an increase from the 60s, then a backward turn after the financial crisis of 2008. So it's just one of those stark stats that, I always look at the chart and think, that how do you argue against structural inequality when you see those figures over time? And that, that affects people's life chances pretty significantly.
Now, I'm going to tell the listeners at home my theory about critical race theory, because I've got a theory about what's going on, the politics of what's going on here. But you have to go, because I'm looking at the time and you're out of time. So I just want to thank you very much, Dr. Brendon, for filling in. As always, you are a champion.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much. And you can just say goodbye. And where people find you?
Can find me on Twitter on Brendon O'Connor 9 or at the University of Sydney at the US Studies Centre if people want to email. But it's lovely people getting in touch on Twitter, either critically or friendly. It's I'm really taken by the loyal following of people you have for the show. It's pretty impressive, and that it's great that there's a bunch of fanatics out there who want to listen to all this amount of data and continue talk about the United States. So great to be with you, Chaz.
They are the very best of the internet, and we do not deserve them. Thank you very much, Dr. Brendon. Thanks a lot, as always. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Okay, guys, I'll tell you my theory briefly here. Oh, look at that. You can look at me in stereo if you're watching on TV. Okay, so the point I want to make, because we said this before, it's a uni topic, it's not discussed in primary schools. I don't want to make that, that's all true, but I don't want to make that point. I want to make a different point. I want to make the point that the two sides of this debate have been talking at cross purposes, okay? I'm going to do a bit of reading here because I can't have a conversation, so I'll just read my notes. It's true that no one at school uses the phrase critical race theory, and I strongly suspect that very few of them are using concepts from critical race theory as well, because it's complicated stuff, and a lot of these people are idiots. But there are a series of extremely suspect moves being made in schools right now. In fact, all over America. Oh, there I'm gone from the screen. And what's happening is hyper-woke people try to enforce their morality code on others based on their hyper-wokeness. And that's what people are talking about. Every day, literally every day, there's a news story in the conservative media about someone going on about whiteness this, acting like it's a cancer, or people deliberately suggesting that white people are going around deliberately trying to oppress black people, and conservatives get all worked up about that, right? But that's not about critical race theory. That's about wokeness. We all know those people. We see them on Twitter all the time, right? And that's what I think the right mean when they say critical race theory. They mean hyper-wokeness. They do it about transgender people as, like, this, there are transgender issues with this as well, where I'm not going to go into them, but there is definitely a hyper-woke group of people out there who are trying to push a particular political agenda. Some of them are teachers, some of them are not, and the right are offended by that. But they call it critical race theory when what they mean is hyper-wokeness. Why am I splitting hairs like this? The reason is because they are misdiagnosing the issue. And you can't solve a problem or even debate a problem if you're not saying what the problem is. And I've got a great example of what I'm talking about here. The king of critical race theory is this guy called Christopher Rufo, who's been the one who popularised the concept of, they're teaching critical race theory at schools as much as anyone. And he did this tweet where he said, "We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in a newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans." Now, people heard that and they thought he was saying it was all a cynical move to invent a bad guy for the culture war. But then he clarified. I want to read his clarification because I think it actually sheds light on this. He said, I don't mean to say that we should have unrelated things labelled critical race theory. That's not at all what I mean. What I'm saying is that if someone is reading a newspaper and they see there's the kind of black, Indigenous, people of colour only income program in Oakland, or they're only distributing COVID vaccines to minorities in Vermont, or they're demolishing standardised testing and competitive admissions in Virginia, all of those things can be understood through the framework of critical race theory. So when someone sees those items, rather than attacking them individually to try to understand them, we're providing them with a framework. We're providing them a lens. We're providing them an ideology, critical race theory, so they can understand the connections between those things. And then we can attack critical race theory at its ideological roots, rather than trying to fight one by one and in whack-a-mole about these individual stories. So he thinks all the wokeness stuff is connected by critical race theory. And it probably is for some people, but for most of the randoms out there who haven't even heard of it, it's not. It's just because they're woke. That's it. And okay, so why does this matter? Firstly, like I said, I think it's important to identify what's going on. Chasing after ghosts are not going to solve anything. Let's define what we're talking about. Second, there's an obvious political angle to this, which I want to tell you briefly, because I really hate it. Matt Gertz from Media Matters. I don't like Media Matters often, but I think he's really noted. I think he's nailed this one. He knows the cycle. You observe an outrage. You tell conservative media. That then raises funds and gets attention for advocacy groups. They grow, and then they find more material for conservative media, which keeps the cycle going. Meanwhile, politicians get involved to pass legislation because of conservative media, which makes it more of a story, creates victories for the advocacy groups, which encourage other people to report instances, and the cycle continues. And every step creates more of a frenzy amongst the right-wing base, which shows up everywhere from enraged social media engagement to public meeting uproars. Even more so, by the way, this is not Matt Gertz, this is me. Lefties get their back up and start defending the practice for partisan reasons because they see right-wingers going on about it, so they defend it, which gives the right even more material then, because the lefties then become what they are being accused of, essentially, for partisan reasons. The result of this is now 165 local and national groups that aim to disrupt lessons on race and gender as a result of this cycle. And some of them become huge. No Left Turn went from fewer than 200 followers to more than 30,000 after they appeared on Tucker Carlson's show once. Now they've got 30 chapters in 23 states. And every single day there's another example, probably 2 examples per day in conservative media. And some of them are, I'm not on their bandwagon, but some of them go, wow, that's a pretty good example. I just don't think it illustrates what they're saying it illustrates. Yeah, and that's not hard to have 2 or 3 examples a day because there's 1 million schools in America. So maybe 100 examples. That's not hard to find if you're looking hard enough. And man, they are looking hard enough right now. And the political angle is this all becomes about Democrats. This becomes a new Tea Party, because even though this has got nothing to do with the Democrats, all these people are lefties, and so people start to define it as Democrats, and Democrats start defending it. They're for partisan reasons because the right-wingers are criticising it. Now, Biden's obviously got nothing to do with this, but the conservative media are definitely trying to make this about Democrats. And I point out, the big story right now, which I'm not going to go into because I don't have the time, I'm going to get chucked out of here in about 5 minutes, by the way. Logan County in Virginia is right now the central area for this controversy, this critical race theory. There's a school there which people are going crazy about. It's all critical race theory central. There happens to be a place where there's a lot of doctors' wives. In Virginia, there's a governor's election this year. It is so obvious that they're trying to make this an electoral issue in Virginia to win back the people that the Democrats just won over from Republicans, the college-educated kind of conservatives that voted for Biden. They're trying to win them back with this. And yeah, they may win, it may work, it may not. But I just want to flag, that's what's going on. It's the political, that's the political side of it, which I hate, because I think there's a real problem with woke people going crazy. And I feel like a number of times I talk to my friends about, oh my God, did you see that? And they go, yeah, but it's not about critical race theory. Critical race theory is necessary to deal with inequality. It's not about structural racism, it's just about woke people. So let's just call it like we say. Anyway. Hey there. Now, when I left you, I had exactly 3 minutes to say everything I had to say about the friendly Jordies thing, and I spoke as quickly as I can. And let me tell you, I can speak very quickly. But unfortunately, while I did that, I committed contempt of court at least 3 times, possibly 4 times, and I did it on an ABC set. So that could have been bad for me, and bad for the ABC, and bad for Australian broadcasting in general, given that some of the people involved in this particular situation have shown a tendency to sue. So I did need to record this one more time. Unfortunately, it's now quite late. I was just about to put up the podcast, and Dave, who it's his camera, he needs to leave. So I can't be too much longer, but I am going to take more than 3 minutes. I'm going to get it right, and I'm hopefully not going to break any laws. So let me tell you about the Friendly Jordies, my view of the Friendly Jordies thing, because I've been asked literally by about 20 different people to speak about this. MediaWatch just did something on this the other day. You can have a look for yourself. It's probably better than what I'm about to do. I haven't had a chance to prepare this properly. I literally just went off top of my head before, and this time I was just about to put up the podcast when I noticed how many times I broke the law. So I haven't had time to really write I've written a few notes here, but not my best effort. I'll enough throat clearing. Okay. First of all, I just want to get down. You'll notice a lot of the people who are supporting Friendly Jordies are essentially his supporters, especially his political supporters. This is the nature of the internet these days. People support the people on their side. If they're not on your side, they shut up, even if there's an outrage. So I want to make very clear, I'm not actually on Jordies' side of any cultural divide, even though we loosely are from the same professional world. Politically, he's much more left than I am. He's a Labor guy. I am not a Labor guy. I don't believe in doing comedy for political, not for political purposes, but being paid by politicians to do comedy. I don't believe that. He's been paid, at least in the past, by political groups, by unions. I don't know if he's still paid by unions or not. I wouldn't be surprised because he hasn't changed his tone, but I don't, personally, I see that as propaganda. I think if people who get paid by political groups to make comedy should have disclaimers all over the place. They should be very, very clear, because otherwise, in my view, it's misleading. So I've got a bit of a problem with that as well. As I said, I don't know if this is still the case, but just generally, I worry about propaganda when it comes to comedy. Also, just his brand of comedy is different to what I do. He's a bit more silly wigs, silly voices kind of thing. He's definitely a lot more abusive than I like. Look, I'll be honest, I do watch a lot of his stuff, and I do find myself laughing at times in spite of myself. Sometimes he does brilliant stuff, no doubt, but it's not generally my bag. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which, like, I find him slightly nasty, a little bit personal and a bit dogged. That might sound ridiculous coming from me. It might sound incredibly hypocritical coming from me, given that my career was started with The Chaser, which was a group that literally hired researchers to find people's addresses, home addresses, so we could stalk them outside their house at 6 a.m. and then pull some prank. So I understand. That is all true. And Jordies does none of that. So I do accept that, why you'd say that was hypocritical. But what you might not realise is that we used to consider the line between comedy and harassment a lot, because we didn't want to be bullies. And now I want to emphasise, I'm not accusing Jordies of being a bully, because we had a much bigger stick than he has. We had a TV show with 1.5 million viewers. Every time we say one sentence, it goes a long way. So it's a different situation. But we were acutely conscious of that. And to be honest, one of my perennial regrets, in fact, it's my greatest regret from The War on Everything, was how hard we got Naomi Robson. Making fun of current affairs, absolutely. Piece of shit show, Today Tonight, no doubt. But I felt we made way too many personal jokes about her. It wasn't about her personally. It wasn't about whether she'd had plastic surgery. It wasn't about how she looked or how she spoke or how she carried herself. All those were kind of cheap shots, and I felt guilty at the time. This is not hindsight speaking. I felt guilty at the time, and that's why with Anna Corrin, we did none of that. We made none of those kinds of jokes with Anna Corrin the year after, because we kind of felt guilty about it. We made a mistake there. So anyway, this is my long way of saying, I'm not saying I'm perfect. It might be slightly hypocritical, but I do agree. I do feel that Friendly Jordies does go a lot harder than we did, and it makes me slightly uncomfortable. This is all my way of saying I am not on the same side of the cultural divide as he is. But, man, am I on his side. The stuff we're about to talk about. It's got, yeah, so despite everything else, I am on his side. So let me tell you about the situation. I can't spend forever talking about this because Dave's waiting for his camera. But essentially, there's a guy called John Barilaro, who's he's the deputy leader in New South Wales. He's a national. I must admit, I hadn't even heard about him until Friendly Jordies got into legal trouble with him. But so he's made him a lot more well known, at least in my house. Friendly Jordies has a thing about him. The two of them have been at each other. Well, Jordies has been at Barilaro for quite some time. And as a result of that, first Barilaro sued him for defamation, and then after that, Jordies turned up at one of his drinks, and 6 weeks later, Jordies' producer, a guy called Christo Lanka, turned up. Just happened to be, they say, he just happened to be in the vicinity when Barilaro was just speaking on his phone outside the car, and he approached him for like 2 seconds. I'll show you the video soon. And as a result of that, those two incidents, he has now been arrested by the terror police. So that's the broad story. So let's go into slightly more detail. To the issues at hand. First of all, the first issue is the defamation lawsuit, which people seem to be forgetting. They just go, wave their hands and go, oh, well, the defamation lawsuit will sort itself out. To me, the defamation lawsuit is actually almost the main thing, because I have a lot of experience with defamation lawsuits. We had I can't go into too much detail because as part of the settlement, we are not allowed to discuss it in detail. But I'm sure people remember the incident. I can say what the incident was, which was, about, I think it's 2014, off the top of my head, maybe 2013. We made a joke about Chris Kenny where we put up a photo of him, a Photoshop of him supposedly having sex with a dog. Right now, it wasn't a very realistic Photoshop. It was not meant to be taken realistically. We were not accusing him of having sex with dogs. In fact, the joke was at our expense. The joke was that this was after he had just said, straight after the coalition won the federal election, he immediately said, well, let's start defunding the ABC. And we made a joke about, oh, you don't want to talk like that about the ABC because they can be very thin-skinned. Oh, but not us. We're not thin-skinned. We're very mature. And then we put up that photo. The idea was, yes, we are thin-skinned. We're making a joke at our own expense. Okay, that was the extent of what we said about Chris Kenny. That was what we got sued for defamation. So it wasn't a claim of truth. It wasn't a serious statement. It wasn't anything that anyone would take seriously. But because of the way defamation law works in New South Wales and in Australia generally, we looked like we were going to lose, hence the settlement. Now, the reason why we looked like we were going to lose was because even though we weren't making a claim of truth or anything, a claim that, like a factual claim that would be taken seriously, we were exposing him to vitriol and to contempt and diminishing his reputation, or so it goes. So they weren't the exact words that we used, something like that. That's the concept. The concept is, if you're a journalist and you accuse someone of some kind of factual you accuse them of doing something bad, couldn't find the word, then you better be truthful. You better be able to prove it. But if you're just generally exposing them to vitriol, that in itself is potentially a cause for defamation proceedings. And this is where Jordan might get himself into a bit of trouble. You can like defamation law, you can not like defamation law. I'm not having a go at John Barilaro for taking advantage of defamation law. That is his right. I'm just saying that I personally don't think defamation law should be like that. I think you should be able to make jokes about people. I think you shouldn't be able to lie about people, but if you're basically just taking the piss out of them, I don't think you should be liable for potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars of damages. And that is where I fear that Jordan is at the moment. During his videos, he's talking about, oh, I can prove this, I can prove that, this is going to be true, this is not going to be true. We made one joke which wasn't even at Chris Kenny's expense. He's made a lot of jokes at John Barilaro's expense. Lot of jokes. Implied that he's a con man, all the rest of it. Said it flat out. Even if every single thing he says, that's a factual claim, he can prove to be true, it'll be interesting to see how that goes with defamation law. That's what I'm saying. Now, that's the first issue. The second issue is that his producer, Christo Lanka, has been charged with stalk or intimidate, intending to cause fear of physical or mental harm. And that's as a result of those two incidents I described to you. Why don't we look at both those incidents and then you can decide for yourself. This is the first incident.
Let's go.
John, you cynical son! Why are you threatening to sue me? Why you do this? Why you threatening to sue? I cannot believe this! I cannot believe! Hey, you can't! Come on! You cannot touch him! Do not do that move! Hey! The stress of a beard, man from the bush! A bush! Yes! Man from the bush in Sydney! I like your house in respect as a man! Yes! Johnny! Yes! Why you not talking to me? You don't answer your phone! John!
It is a public offense. John, I've got some documents you might want to see. I've got get out of here. I got an Italian class. Yes, that is assault. That is assault. John, why are you suing? That is assault. That is assault. Why don't you sit over on the edge? No, why don't you relax? It is assault. I'm allowed to go through. You're not ruining our bloody event, so you can do your YouTube moment. Why don't you go away and let us do our bloody university event?
Come on! We're having fun! Hey, where's the rest of the gang?
You're not.
What did you say?
You're not allowed to film.
No, I am.
This is where I committed contempt of court before. I'm not going to say what I think about this. I'm not going to say whether I feel that was stalking or intimidating, intending to cause fear of physical or mental harm. I'm not going to prejudge because I don't know if this is going to be a jury trial. I don't know what the situation with this is. But you look at that video yourself and you decide if you feel, number one, that John Barilaro looked intimidated. You decide for yourself if that's the case. You decide whether you think the purpose of that visit was to cause fear of physical or mental harm. That was ask yourself if that's the purpose of the visit. You make up your own mind. Okay. I should say, by the way, as well, there's an interesting aspect there as well. I don't know. I mean, John Barilaro presumably has good lawyers, so they've probably looked into this. But that was at a university bar. I don't know the people who asked him to go, but when we did Chaser stuff, if someone asks you to go, you go straight away. Now, what we did, the Chaser special, was to do what Jordan did in that video, and to back out. So they tell you to go, to back out and to yell out lines as you go, and then film just outside, you doing a few more lines. That was the Chaser special. We did it all the time. But his producer did not do that. His producer kept there and kept on going even after he was asked to leave, which potentially could open it up to trespass. Now, I don't want to give him any ideas, but like I said, any lawyer would be aware of that possibility if it was either private property or he was asked by the owner of that property. Now, it was a university bar, so I don't know how the property works there. I don't know who exactly asked him to leave, whether they had the right to ask him to leave. Maybe he had every right to be there as long as he wanted. But that to me, from a Chaser point of view, as soon as I saw that, I thought, oh, is he opening himself up to trespass there? That's because that's a whole different kettle of fish. But let's leave that aside for now. I should show you the second incident as well. This is the second incident now.
Hey, John. Hey, John. I've got something for you. John, I've got a lawsuit. You're suing my boss. John.
Once again, you decide. Do you feel like what you just saw then, if that is indeed the whole video, which Jordan Shanks assures us it is the whole video, as it is the whole incident from beginning to end. He just happened to be walking past, he saw him, picked up his camera, and you saw the entire exchange. Is he stalking or intimidating, intending to cause fear of physical or mental harm? Once again, you make up your own mind. I have made my own mind, and I will not say what it is. What I will say though is that the court can decide that, and I do have a lot of faith in courts to decide that kind of stuff because of my own experiences. I got charged when we did the Bulldog stunt, which was back in 2006. I was outside a Canterbury Bulldogs rugby league match selling Rohypnol, Rohypnol in Canterbury colours and flick knives in Canterbury colours and knuckle dusters in Canterbury colours because at that point in time, their players and their supporters had a bit of form. I got charged with, I think it was unruly behaviour. I'm not 100% sure about that. Something like that. Unruly behaviour. I don't know. It was one of those catch-all kind of charges where it was just being bad, essentially. The police were just completely wrong in their facts. They testified in court, and what they said was completely wrong, like completely inaccurate, even though we had sent them the video months before the trial, and the video directly contradicted them. Furthermore, the police also had this database, which they called the COPS database, the COPS database, which they mentioned, and so we asked to see their entries on our COPS database since they brought them up, and their entries are also completely inaccurate. What they said about us, as far as they thought the facts about us were all wrong. We had done a sketch where Chris had gone up to people with a stocking on his head and just acted normal. And the joke is people are scared of you when you have a stocking on your head, even if you're just speaking normally and not doing anything threatening at all. That was the joke. It was a sketch. It was clearly a set-up sketch. You couldn't do that legally for real. They had it in our databases. That was me who did it and did it for real. That was what they said. But anyway, and they testified under oath on the stand for a whole bunch of things that did not happen. We didn't even have to defend ourselves because we just showed them the video and that was it. Case dismissed. Now, it may well be that if the police have indeed lied about what happened, as Jordan Shanks suggests they have, they'll just do the same thing. They'll just whip out the video and go, here you go, Your Honour, and then they'll be let off and then they'll go. That may well be the case. I hope that is the case, should they be innocent of these charges. But the fact is that whether the police lie or not, that gets sorted out in court. So I'm not too worried about whether the police are accurate about their claims. The next issue is Christo's bail conditions. He's not allowed to, according to Jordan Shanks, He's not allowed to approach or contact John Barilaro unless it's through a lawyer. That's fair enough. Now, bear in mind, these guys have been charged with intimidation and stalking. He's been if he was indeed guilty of intimidation, of course he shouldn't be able to approach or contact John Barilaro unless it's through a lawyer. If he's actually been intimidating or stalking, of course he shouldn't go within 200 metres of any place where John Barilaro lives or works. It might be a pain in the ass, but if he is indeed intimidating, stalking people, he shouldn't go near them. Fair enough. He's not allowed to possess or share images of caricatures of John Barilaro. Sorry, hang on. What's that got to do with stalking or intimidating? Not even posting the image or caricatures, possessing the images or caricatures. He's not allowed to have a photo of John Barilaro in his possession. What's that got to do with intimidation? He's not allowed to comment on the behaviour or personal appearance of John Barilaro. Now, on one hand, you go, okay, Jordies has had a red-hot go at John Barilaro for a long time. I can see why Barilaro is sick to death of it. Yeah, the defamation proceedings is going forward. But what's that got to... These are the bail conditions for his intimidation charge. What's that got to do with intimidation? Commenting on the behaviour or personal appearance of John Barilaro. Is that intimidating to make a fat joke? Well, you make your own mind up about that. Participate in the publishing of content further harassing Barilaro. See, to me, a lot of these bail conditions are about their speech. It's not about intimidation or stalking, in my view. And I think that's a problem. I feel like they're using his bail to shut him up, as opposed to dealing with the alleged stalking or intimidation, which they shouldn't be doing, in my view. Next, a lot of people talk about freedom of speech. Oh, this is about... No, Australia doesn't have freedom of speech. Australia doesn't have anything even close to freedom of speech. I wish people would get used to that so we can change it. I wish Australia did have freedom of speech. I wish that our defamation laws were not like this for public figures. I wish that you could insult the Deputy Premier and then not get arrested by the terror police. But this is the world that we live in Australia. So why don't we get together and actually actually pass some laws so there is some freedom of speech? We do not have it. This doesn't change anything. We didn't have it before, and we don't have it now. I find it so frustrating. Anyway, there's another related argument. There's an argument this is an attack on journalism. That Friendly Jordies is a journalist. I think that's a line that Friendly Jordies himself pushes. Now, to be honest, I disagree with that slightly, only slightly, in that I don't think there is such a thing as a journalist. I don't mean they're like the tooth fairy, they exist, but I mean, I think an individual can both be a journalist and not a journalist, depending on what they're doing at the time. Journalism, in my view, is conduct. It's not an identity. So yeah, Jordies sometimes acts as a journalist. He really does. He comes up with some really good work at times. At times, he acts like a commentator. At times, he acts like a comedian. At times, he acts like a dickhead. That is definitely the case. And I feel like it's the conduct that should matter, not the person. I think journalists can sometimes not act like journalists. And if we look at the two incidents that Christo's been charged with, I actually don't think either had anything to do with journalism. I think haranguing Barilaro about his lawsuit, him suing them, that's not about journalism. That's about shit stirring. And fair enough, in my view. I don't think... I think the second incident was also not journalism. It was also shit stirring. But, you should be allowed to shit stir. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. You should be allowed to approach a politician in Australia and talk to them in any capacity without having the terror police going Mission Impossible on your ass. I don't see why it matters whether you're a journalist or not. You should be able to talk. If he was indeed intimidating him, then that's another thing altogether. But, well, you decide if you think he was intimidating him. That will be for the court to decide. I personally think that I would be worried if that is the standard for what intimidation is, what I saw. If what I saw on camera is accurate, I would be worried that that would affect journalists. This might not be a direct attack on journalism, but it would affect journalists in the long run, because in the second incident in particular, Christo approached Barilaro exactly like a journalist would. He might have been screwing around, but the manner in which he approached him was just like a journalist, with a camera, asking him questions calmly, and then walking away. He approached Barilaro twice in 6 weeks. Journalists do that. So even if they weren't acting as journalists, even if they themselves had nothing to do with journalism at the time or whatever, the precedents set there can be applied to journalists in another context. So that is a real worry, I feel. The biggest issue of all, though, which is one that everyone's talking about, is what the fuck does this have to do with the terror cops? I mean, because it was the fixated persons unit that arrested Christo, okay? Why can't the police arrest him? Why is it that the day after this happens, if it was the day after, it might have been the same day, I've forgotten. It was pretty soon after. Why was it drop everything, get the terror cops out to arrest this guy? It's so important. It's not like there was any urgency. It's not like there was any fear of immediate consequences if they didn't get out there. Something horrible going to happen. If that is what the terror cops are being used for, we don't need the terror cops. It's time to disband the unit, as far as I'm concerned. If they're going after, if that is typical of what they do. Also, the way they went after him, I'm not going to play the video because I don't want to play the entire arrested video. If you want to see the arrest, you can go to the homework. It's up in the homework, in the blurb under this video, and see for yourself. The arrest, they went pretty hard. I wouldn't say they went all the way Gestapo level, but they were pretty jackbooted when they turned up. My experience is that, and I went on a lot of stunts on John Howard's walks. Like with the chaser, we constantly were turning up to John Howard's walk. And there was times when Craig turned up with a literal chainsaw on John Howard's walk. Now, let me tell you behind the scenes what was going on there. What was going on was the feds, they knew we were there. We didn't hide. We just stood in his path. He went on the same path every single time. And so we just stood next to his path. The feds would come up to us about half an hour before his walk, and they'd say, okay, what's going on here? What's this chainsaw? And we'd explain it to them. They wouldn't tell John Howard. It wasn't about spoiling the joke. It was just about common sense and just checking for safety. They knew we were comedians. They knew we weren't a threat. They knew we weren't terrorists. And so they didn't treat us like terrorists. They treated us like comedians. They knew what to expect from us. And if they got anything that wasn't what they expected, then they would get in the way. And they would then push us aside. And we would deserve to be pushed aside. But what they did was they showed that the higher up you go, the more important your job, the calmer, the more sensible you need to be. It's the old Spider-Man adage, isn't it? With great power comes great responsibility. The feds were always much more sensible and much more reassuring to me than a Hoyt's security guard. Those are the guys who panicked with us. The security guards who had barely any training. They're the ones who are always worried. The feds, they knew what they were doing. So why are these guys being so amateur? They're the terror cops. They should be pretty high up. We trusted the snipers at APEC that they'd do their job. I don't trust the guy I saw in that video to do his job, because he was, in my view, escalating matters way, way, way further than they should have been. So what's going on there? I don't know who made the call that the arrest of a comedian should be carried out by the anti-terror squad. I'd like a name, because if that person's in the police, or if that person is in, well, I'm not going to sound off about things I don't understand. I don't want to be all talk back about this, but I think there's real questions about the judgment of the person who made that call. And I would like to know, I don't need their name, but I would like someone to know their name, and I would like someone to hold them responsible, because that is an abuse of police resources. Okay, so that's my best, pretty much off the top of my head with this. I don't have too much else to share, so they're my opinions. I continue to be, actually, I don't want to commit contempt of court, but I feel like the video speaks for itself a lot with these charges, and the video spoke for us as well. And if that is indeed the case, I'm not sure that the charges against Christo are going to be his biggest concern. I suspect that the defamation lawsuit may be, in a year's time, the biggest concern for these guys. It doesn't mean that the most serious issues for society as a whole aren't what's going on with those terror cops. But I feel like let's not forget the defamation, because we're not all going to get arrested by terror cops, but we are all definitely restricted by the lack of freedom of speech in Australia and the fact that defamation, man, if you say anything against anyone, you have the money, you're in a pretty good position with defamation law in Australia. And I think there should be more protection. And I hope that that's something that we all take away from this going forward. That's something we can do something about quite easily. And I think Australia would be much better off if we did. Okay. I did now took a lot more than 3 minutes. Just imagine how shit that 3-minute effort was. As I said before, we're going to have a break now for 3 weeks. We'll be back in 3 weeks. I'm probably going to do a podcast within the next 3 weeks when Dave... Next time Dave will be in the seat next to me. He's almost better now. And we're in lockdown, so we'll wait till lockdown's over. But we'll get something out to you soon. Hope you guys enjoy the, inverted commas, American summer. I'll see you guys next time. Have a good... Well, you won't have a holiday, sorry. But we've got school holidays, you will. Otherwise, have a good next 3 weeks. Bye.